Something is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz that could drag the entire world into a far bigger crisis than most people realize. In the dark waters off Iran's coast, ships are moving again. Some are tankers with their signals twisted or hidden. Some are escort craft. Some are bait. And somewhere beyond the horizon, American warships are waiting with orders that leave almost no room for hesitation. The blockade was supposed to choke Iran. Instead, it has turned the Gulf into a floating trap. And when Iran's fleet tried to run it, Washington did not answer with warnings. It answered with force. But here's the question no one can ignore now. Did the White House just stop a breakout or light the fuse for something much bigger? For weeks, the confrontation had been building toward this exact moment. A fragile ceasefire was hanging by a thread. Peace proposals were being passed around through mediators. Publicly, everyone was talking about restraint. Quietly, both sides were preparing for the next collision. Then came the blockade. Not just a symbolic move, not just another sanctions package. This was physical pressure at sea, a direct attempt to seal off Iranian ports, disrupt shipping, and squeeze the one artery Tehran could not afford to lose. That artery was oil. Iran's economy has survived years of pressure by doing one thing better than almost anyone expected. It learned how to move energy through a maze of front companies, renamed vessels, cargo transfers, hidden ownership chains, and shadow routes that stretch from the Gulf to Asia. What most people do not realize is that this fleet was never just a collection of ships. It was a survival system. It kept money flowing, it kept allies paid, it kept leverage alive. And when the blockade arrived, Iran was never going to simply watch that system die at anchor. So the standoff became a test of wills. Washington wanted to prove that it could turn maritime pressure into strategic surrender. Tehran wanted to prove that even under maximum pressure, it could still move cargo, still threaten the sea lane, and still make the world pay for trying to isolate it. However, this is where things take a serious turn. Because in the Strait of Hormuz, even a limited move is never really limited. This is one of the most important choke points on Earth. In normal times, a huge share of the world's oil and gas moves through this narrow passage. That means every warship, every tanker, every patrol boat, every missile battery on the shore sits inside a pressure chamber connected directly to fuel prices, insurance rates, supply chains, and politics on multiple continents. A firefight here is never local. It travels through markets within minutes. It reaches capitals within hours. And if enough ships stop moving, it reaches ordinary people at the gas pump almost immediately. That is why the first days of the blockade were so tense. Traffic had already fallen far below normal wartime panic levels. Insurance costs were soaring. Captains were rerouting where they could and hesitating where they could not. But the water never truly emptied. It rarely does. Vessels still tried to pass. Some complied with orders and turned back. Some stayed just outside the line. Others kept moving in ways that looked ordinary until you looked closer. And that is where Iran's real answer began to appear. Not in a giant cinematic battle fleet cutting across the water in daylight. Not in a single dramatic column of warships. Iran's fleet, in the most dangerous sense, is far more elusive than that. It is a mix of formal naval power, Revolutionary Guard speedboats, missile batteries along the coast, island positions near the mouth of the strait, and an oil smuggling network that has spent years learning how to vanish in plain sight. The challenge for the United States was not just stopping ships. It was figuring out which ships mattered, which ones were decoys, which ones were legal headaches, and which one might trigger the next exchange of fire. And the pressure climbed another level. An Iranian-flagged cargo ship pushed toward the blockade line and was seized after repeated warnings, with American forces disabling it and taking control. That alone would have been enough to shake the region. A blockade is one thing on paper. It is something very different when warships actually fire on a commercial vessel and board it. Suddenly, the confrontation was no longer theoretical. It had crossed into a new phase. Tehran called it piracy. Washington called it enforcement. The ceasefire looked weaker by the hour. But what happened next changed everything. The sea did not quiet down after that seizure. It got more dangerous. Instead of backing away, Iran's wider shipping network kept probing. Tankers linked to Iranian trade kept trying to move through the system. Some cargoes were carried by vessels with long sanction histories. Some oil had already been shifted from ship to ship. Some was disguised through false origins and paperwork games that had become almost routine in the shadow trade. The point was not simply to move barrels. The point was to prove the blockade was porous. And on that front, Tehran had a reason to feel confident. China remained the main lifeline. The vast majority of Iran's shipped oil had one primary destination. Chinese independent refiners had spent years buying crude others would not touch, often through murky middlemen and relabeled shipments. Even when sanctions tightened, the trade adapted. Cargoes were renamed, origins changed on paper, ownership blurred, payments moved in ways built to avoid the obvious choke points. By the time a barrel reached its buyer, the trail behind it often looked like fog. So when Washington announced new sanctions on refiners, shipping firms, and shadow fleet vessels, the message was clear. The United States was no longer satisfied with abstract financial punishment. It wanted to strangle the network itself, cut the ships off, cut the buyers off, cut the insurers off, cut the facilitators off. But there was a brutal catch. The more effective this strategy became, the closer it pushed both sides toward direct confrontation at sea. The confrontation exploded again in early May. American officials said Iranian-linked tankers were trying to skirt the blockade. Iranian officials said the United States was violating the ceasefire and attacking shipping under the cover of enforcement. Both sides accused the other of escalation. Both sides claimed success. Then reports emerged of destroyers under fire during a tense passage through Hormuz. Washington insisted its ships took no damage and that Iranian attackers were hit hard. Tehran insisted the opposite. In the fog of competing claims, one reality stood out above all others. The ceasefire was becoming more like a hallway full of loaded guns than a path to peace. And still, the tankers kept coming. This is the part of the story most casual viewers miss. When people hear the phrase fleet, they imagine one concentrated formation that can be tracked, targeted, and smashed in a single blow. But Iran's fleet, the one that really matters economically, does not work like that. It behaves more like a bloodstream. You can hit individual vessels. You can seize one ship. You can disable another. You can sanction companies by the dozens. But as long as enough oil is already moving outside the immediate blockade zone, as long as enough cargo can be relabeled or transferred, and as long as buyers still exist, the system can keep pulsing. That is why this battle is so dangerous. It creates an illusion of control. Each side can score visible victories while the underlying risk keeps growing. Washington can intercept ships and announce discipline. Tehran can slip cargoes through and claim endurance. Meanwhile, commercial traffic shrinks, insurance markets panic, crews get trapped in limbo, and every commander in the region starts operating closer to the edge. However, this is where things take an even darker turn. Iran's leverage has never depended only on getting its own exports through. It also depends on everyone else fearing what happens if the strait becomes unmanageable. Tehran cannot outmatch the United States Navy in a conventional showdown. It knows that, but it does not need to. It only needs to raise the cost of pressure high enough that the rest of the world starts asking whether enforcing the blockade is worth the chaos. A few damaged ships, a few missile scares, a fire at a port, a spike in oil, a surge in freight rates. That is how a weaker power turns geography into a weapon. And geography is on Iran's side in ways maps do not fully capture. The coastline is long, the surrounding waters are crowded, islands and inlets matter. Missile sites, drones, patrol craft, and fast attack boats can create uncertainty far beyond their size. Merchant captains do not need a full naval battle to panic. They only need enough ambiguity to believe the next transit might go wrong. Once that fear takes hold, the blockade begins reshaping the global economy even before a single decisive naval engagement occurs. Trump's strategy seems built on a simple calculation. Hit the revenue stream hard enough, and Tehran will blink first. If Iranian ships test the line, strike them. If buyers keep purchasing, sanction them. If the shadow fleet adapts, widen the net. The goal is not merely to punish, it is to force a political decision in Tehran by making normal trade impossible. That is the theory. But the reality is far messier. Because every time American forces act, they also create new pressure on diplomacy. Every seizure makes talks harder. Every strike gives hardliners more room to argue that negotiations are meaningless. Every tanker disabled at sea strengthens the argument inside Iran that the blockade is not economic pressure at all, but open warfare by another name. And once that belief hardens, de-escalation becomes much harder than escalation. Then came the images and reports that pushed the crisis into a higher gear. 2 Iranian flagged oil tankers were struck after the United States said they were attempting to violate the blockade. They were reported empty, but that almost made the moment more unsettling, not less. These were not giant cargoes whose destruction would cripple the market overnight. They were signals, messages written in steel and flame. Cross this line and you do not get escorted away. You get hit. For some observers, that looked like decisive enforcement. For others, it looked like the moment the blockade stopped being a pressure tactic and started becoming a rolling naval war. And if that sounds extreme, consider the sequence. First, the sea lane tightens. Then ships are diverted. Then a cargo vessel is disabled and boarded. Then tankers are struck. Then naval units trade fire in and around the same corridor, through which the world depends on uninterrupted energy flow. At what point does everyone stop calling this a standoff and start calling it a war at sea? Yet even now, neither side appears eager for full, uncontrollable escalation. That is what makes the whole situation so unstable. Both Washington and Tehran seem to want dominance without total war, pressure without collapse, retaliation without irreversible commitment. But history shows that narrow waterways do not respect careful intentions. They magnify accidents. They compress decision time. They reward overreaction. One radar misread, one nervous captain, one missile launched too fast, and the whole structure can collapse. There is also a deeper irony here. The blockade was meant to isolate Iran. but it has also exposed how connected Iran's economic survival is to actors far beyond the Gulf. Chinese refiners, shipping brokers, hidden financiers, layered intermediaries, and sanction-resistant logistics all sit somewhere in the background of this showdown. So this is not just a story about American destroyers and Iranian boats. It is also a story about whether a modern sanctions regime can truly shut down an adaptive global network once that network has years of experience operating in the shadows. So far, the answer looks incomplete. Shipments have slowed. Pressure has intensified. Costs have soared. But the network has not vanished. It has bent. It has rerouted. It has disguised itself. It has tested the blockade again and again, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. That alone explains why tempers are rising. A blockade that fails looks weak. A blockade that succeeds risks provoking desperation. There may be no stable middle ground. And that brings us to the most important question of all. What happens if Iran decides that survival requires something bolder than endurance? Not necessarily a grand naval battle, not a suicidal charge into superior firepower. Something subtler, a series of calibrated disruptions, harassment against escorts, more attempts to move tankers under confusing legal or commercial cover, limited attacks that can be denied, enough instability to keep the market nervous and the coalition enforcing pressure politically divided. In that kind of contest, victory is not measured by who controls the water on paper. It is measured by who can keep absorbing pain longer. That is why the phrase wiped off the map can be misleading. Ships can be destroyed. Networks are harder to erase. Sink one vessel, another appears under a new name. Sanction one company, business shifts to another layer. Disable one tanker, cargo's already outside the zone, keep moving toward buyers. The sea is only the visible part of the conflict. Beneath it sits a financial, logistical, and strategic architecture built over years of sanctions pressure. Breaking that architecture requires more than firepower. Still, symbolism matters in war, and that is where Washington may believe it has scored something significant. By striking ships that tested the line, the United States showed that the blockade is not a bluff. By seizing a cargo vessel, it showed that commercial traffic tied to Iran can be physically interrupted, not just legally threatened. By holding destroyers in place during exchanges of fire, it showed that it is willing to absorb risk to keep pressure on. Those signals were aimed not only at Tehran, but at every ship owner, trader, banker, and buyer, calculating whether Iran's oil is still worth the danger. But signals cut both ways. Tehran can also point to every successful transit, every surviving cargo, every rerouted shipment, every spike in global anxiety, and say the same thing. We are still here. We can still move. We can still disrupt. We can still raise the cost. And as long as that message remains believable, the blockade remains contested, no matter how many dramatic headlines come out of the Gulf. So the real climax of this crisis may not be one spectacular explosion. It may be a grinding contest of credibility. Can Washington make the maritime noose tight enough to force concessions before the region catches fire? Can Tehran keep its economic lifeline alive without triggering a response so severe that the remaining room for diplomacy disappears? And can the rest of the world keep pretending this is a contained confrontation when so much energy passes through the same narrow throat? Right now, the answer is still unwritten. The warships are still there. The shadow routes are still active. The ceasefire is still breathing, but only barely. Every tanker that approaches the line now carries more than cargo. It carries a test of resolve, of nerves, of how far each side is willing to go before the crisis breaks open. And that may be the most dangerous part of all. Not that Iran's fleet tried to run the blockade. Not that American power struck back. But that both sides may believe they can keep doing this one step at a time without losing control. History usually ends badly for leaders who make that assumption in a place like Hormuz, because the next ship may not just be another vessel. It may be the moment the entire standoff stops looking like pressure and starts looking like the opening chapter of a much wider war. And if you think this ends with one exchange, think again. Every actor around the Gulf is now reading the same map through a different fear. Ship owners fear losing hulls. Insurers fear a cascade of claims. Energy traders fear a sudden gap in supply. Gulf states fear being pulled into a confrontation they cannot fully control. Washington fears that any sign of hesitation will invite more defiance. Tehran fears that if it accepts the blockade without resistance, it may never recover the leverage it spent decades building. Those fears do not cancel each other out. They stack on top of one another until the entire region starts moving according to worst-case logic. That is why the next move matters more than the last one. If more tankers test the line, the United States will be pushed to respond again or risk looking selective. If more vessels are struck, Iran will be pushed to answer or risk looking cornered. If diplomacy lags behind events at sea, commanders rather than negotiators will start shaping the future by default. And once that happens, the rhythm of the crisis changes. It stops being driven by speeches and starts being driven by contact reports, warning shots, missile alerts, emergency reroutes, and split-second judgments made in crowded water. So when people ask whether Iran's fleet really ran the blockade, they may be asking the wrong question. The more important question is whether the blockade itself can survive this kind of pressure without becoming the very war it was supposed to prevent. Because in Hormuz, success and disaster can look almost identical in the opening hours. A ship turns back. Another gets through. One is seized. Two are hit. Leaders claim victory. Markets panic anyway. And somewhere in that cycle, the space for a controlled ending gets smaller. And in a waterway this narrow, where fear moves faster than fleets, the world may discover too late that containment was always a fragile illusion.